Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle Youngman. I'm with Christian Music Broadcasters. And today we have a special webinar that's just for you as you learn more about music licensing. We have done this in the past, and as we met a few weeks ago with this team, it was evident that it was time for us to really do another update because so many things are changing. And even in the midst of all of the crisis that's going along, there's still things that are progressing with the music licensing and all that entails. And so we've invited these gentlemen to be with us today who are representatives of the NRB MLC. Chris Lemke is a part of CMB's board, and so he is going to be taking care of moderating our discussion. And so I'm going to turn it over to Chris and the NRB MLC folks. So, hi, Chris. How are you? Oh, it looks like you're mute. Let me unmute you. There you go. Hi, Chris.
Sorry about that. Good morning, or in this case, good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thanks for joining us. I want to introduce to you three individuals who are serving on the NRB MLC, and there's also non-commercial representation. Scott Hunter is chair of the NRB Music Licensing Committee, and I'll have him introduce himself, give a little bit more background to how he got that position. Bill Harrier is the compliance officer with the RTN, Radio Training Network, and services the stations based out of Atlanta. Harv Hendrickson, long time with Northwestern Media, is joining us. He too serves on the NRB NMLC, which is the Non-Commercial Music Licensing Committee. So, gentlemen, pleasure to have you aboard. And Scott, I'm going to have you take it away as far as getting us involved or introduced into what exactly is the music licensing scenario of today.
Great. Can everybody hear me and see me? Hello. I thank you, excuse me, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Just a point of clarification, Harv and Bill are the co-chairs of the non-com committee, and I'm the executive director of the committee. But Harv and Bill and I, we basically all work together, so it doesn't matter much. I am here today to kind of provide an overview of the current situation with regard to digital music licensing, particularly focused on how it applies to non-com broadcasters, but some of this will apply to commercial broadcasters as well.
I was going to mention before we even get started too deep into it, what's the difference or why the distinction between the NRB NMLC and the NRB MLC?
It's a good question. There are two separate committees. One of them is the non-com committee. That's Harv and Bill and I. I also serve as the executive director for the commercial committee with a couple of other gentlemen, Russ Hout and Bill Blount. The difference is that the licensing scheme is different. For the non-com broadcasters, a lot of music licensing is handled by statute. So it's actually put in the Copyright Act. For commercial broadcasters, more of the music licensing landscape is covered by negotiations and unfortunately litigation when it's necessary. So you've got two largely different licensing schemes in place.
Got it. And of course, the formation of the committees have happened in part to negotiate on behalf of the radio stations, both commercial and non-commercial. I'm going to put up our first slide, and why don't you go ahead and tell us what we've got, what we're dealing with.
Sure. Here we go. Just wait for the slide to show up here. Terrific. Yeah, so just a little bit about the general landscape before we jump into the presentation. There are always a lot of things happening in music licensing. In 2020, even with the COVID-19 crisis, there's more than normal that's happening right now. So our committee is as busy as we've ever been. We're going to talk in this presentation about a particular proceeding that applies to everybody on this call, which is the Webcaster 5 proceeding. But beyond that, and outside the scope of this presentation, on both the commercial and the non-commercial front, we're working on probably a dozen different things right now, with whether it be litigation, whether it be negotiations with PROs, whether it be gathering data to respond to other litigation that's going on. So lots happening. With this presentation, I wanted to kind of insert a little bit of levity in our lives. We could all use that now. So there's going to be a little bit of interaction, which you guys can use via chat if you're interested. And let's go to the next slide. We can kind of start with that. So one of the things that I think is a good icebreaker, and if you're doing lots of Zoom meetings these days, icebreakers can still work. You just have to do them in a different way, is who was your favorite artist or group now? And how about when you were in high school? So give some thought to who your favorite artist or group was now, and how about who you loved in high school. That picture on the bottom right, I'm not ashamed to admit, they were my favorite group in high school. Anybody have any guesses on chat as to who those guys are? No takers?
No takers.
That is Rush. So, you know, kind of heavy metal. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so they were kind of a favorite band of mine. So let's go to the next slide. I don't know, we've talked about PROs. There's a couple of different licenses or royalties that you need to focus on as we go through this presentation. And these PROs, ASCAP, BMI, Global Music Rights, and CSAC, they're the folks that you pay for compositions. So you're paying for the musical work, not the sound recording. An easy way to look at this is if let's say Carole King is a songwriter. Carole King's a prolific songwriter. She's written songs that have been covered by lots of people. If you're paying ASCAP, BMI, GMR, or CSAC, you're paying Carole King when somebody covers her song, and that song is being performed on the radio. So this group, the musical work. Let's go to the next slide. We can talk about other royalties. Sound exchange is the group that you pay when you're transmitting digitally, and the group that you pay for sound recordings. So in this instance, Sound Exchange kind of takes the place of all the other PROs. They're a one-stop shop. They're the only group that's out there. They take royalties. They pay them to artists and labels. It's all digital plays. And importantly, Sound Exchange manages streaming and webcasting only with respect to the proceedings that we're involved with. So if you're a non-commercial or a commercial broadcaster, what you pay Sound Exchange is for your digital stream, which is simulcast with your broadcast, or a webcast, which is non-interactive. It's important to note that Sound Exchange does not cover podcasts. In fact, we get this question a lot. There is no easy licensing source for podcasts as we exist today. So this is why if you listen to a lot of podcasts, you'll hear a lot of production music. You'll hear a lot of, hey, my friend is in a band and here's this instrumental, as opposed to popular music on podcasts. If you are playing popular music on podcasts, you are taking a little bit of risk. And I stress it's a little bit of risk in that no one, to my knowledge, has been sued for use of music in a podcast. And that's just because there are all these technical rights that are required to license. So no need to panic if you've got music in a podcast. But what I would say is if you are doing a podcast of, say, top 10 CCM songs, and you're playing those songs as part of a downloadable podcast file, I'd probably shy away from that, or reach out to counsel. You can reach out to me, and I'm happy to have a one-on-one conversation with you about it. That's where your greatest risk is. If you have podcast music where you've got, say, a morning show that you're cutting, best of, and there's a little bit of music that bleeds in as bumper or background music, you're probably fine with that. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit more about Sound Exchange. They generally require that you pay attention 24/7 to what's happening on your stream. Now, if you're a non-com station and you're below a statutory threshold, and many folks are, then you don't have to worry as much about this. But typically, you're going to be submitting reports monthly, or you're going to submit them quarterly to Sound Exchange. And Sound Exchange wants a lot of data. They want metadata and listener count so they can match up the song that's being played with the number of listeners that are listening to that song. And that data is usually provided by your stream provider. You might work with Stream Guys, you might work with Triton, you might work with another third-party stream provider, but that metadata is usually collected and presented to you in reports so that you can then give it to Sound Exchange. The other thing that's important to know about Sound Exchange now is that we as a committee are currently in a rate setting proceeding, which is called Web 5, and that is primarily with Sound Exchange. And the next slide, if we can take a look at that, we'll dig into this a little further. So Web 5 is shorthand for Webcasters 5, which is an informal reference to the rate setting proceedings that take place for all of digital music consumption. So the current proceeding is setting rates for 2021 through 2025. Who makes these decisions? It's a bunch of copyright royalty judges. There are 3 of them. They're literally going to be in a basement in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. That's where this proceeding takes place. It's not a fancy courtroom. It's a basement in the Library of Congress. There's probably nobody in that basement today. And the people that are participating on the licensee side are the National Association of Broadcasters. Those folks, if you're a commercial station or if you operate commercial stations, the NAB has your back. The NAB is the group that's representing commercial stations in this proceeding. Then you've got Pandora and SiriusXM. They're merged as one company. Google's also in this proceeding. And then finally, our committee here is a direct participant in this proceeding, the NRB and MLC. We represent non-commercial religious broadcasters in connection with this proceeding. The other side is Sound Exchange and record companies and recording artists. So Sound Exchange that's their membership. And it's important to note here, our goal is not to pay no royalties. Sound Exchange is not the enemy. Sound Exchange has a job to do. Their job is to get as much as they can, reasonably speaking, for record companies and for recording artists, excuse me. Our job is to seek rate relief for your stations. And so we're on opposite sides of the table, but at the end of the day, I honestly believe that everyone's just looking to make sure that songwriters and musicians are getting paid a fair royalty for the music that they perform. So when does this hearing begin for this proceeding? Well, it was supposed to start on March 16th, but like just about everything else in the world, COVID-19 has interrupted that process and our schedule. The current information is that hearing is going to start in June sometime, but that's a date that's subject to further delay.
And as Farron just asked, these rates will start for 2021.
Yeah, they will. In fact, it's a good question, Farron. Technically, in a normal world, they'd start January 1st, 2021. We believe somewhere in the 880-page stimulus bill that was passed by Congress, they actually included a provision that delays the timeline for the judges to make a decision. So I think the rates will actually not be set until the beginning of 2021. Normally, they're set in December in a normal schedule. So we'll go on what's called an interim license with Sound Exchange, and we'll pay under the current structure until the rates are set, and then they'll do a true-up. So they'll be effective 1/1/2021, but there may be a little bit of an overlap and a true-up that takes place. So yeah, let's take another little break here. CCM Music. I'm guessing everyone's familiar with CCM Music on this webinar. So I figured I'd throw some old and new artists out here. Again, we can use chat if people are interested in using chat. How many of these folks do you recognize? Are they all pretty much second nature to you? I kind of wanted to go across a few decades. Anybody stumped? Anybody not sure who somebody is? and I'm going to go from memory here, and I'm going to see, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the guy on the top left is Danny Goki, and then I think that's Casting Crowns next to him. I know for sure it's Crowder in the middle, and I believe it's Sandy Patty and Jeremy Camp. Jars of Clay is in the left second row. I think that's Amy Grant, Toby Mack, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Francesca Battistelli, Michael W. Smith, Chris Tomlin, Keith Green. I'm not that old, but I do like Keith Green a lot. Mercy Me, and for King and Country. Tell me if I got any of those wrong, but I think that's right. It's been a little while since I took a look at this. So, next slide. Our committees. We chatted a little bit about this before we started. The NRB MLC is the standing, we're both standing committees of the NRB. What does that mean? It really doesn't mean a lot. We are under the umbrella of the NRB, but we are not funded by the NRB, and we have very little accountability, to be honest, to the NRB. They'll audit our books once a year. We report to their executive committee, but they pretty well let us do this on our own. I guess we haven't screwed up enough yet to where they've gotten too upset about it. So they just kind of let us do our thing. Our mission is to obtain fair music license rates, especially for radio stations that use less music. This is on the commercial side. Our lane, our sweet spot is long-form programming. So think Focus on the Family, Insight for Living, Alistair Begg, you know, those types of programs. We negotiate with the PROs. We litigate with them if we have to. We've gone to rate court with ASCAP many years ago. We're doing the CRB litigation now. We also advocate. We advocate with a lobbyist that we have on retainer. That lobbyist is very valuable to our committee in getting us in front of relevant Congress people and legislative people and even administrative branch people, the Department of Justice. Harv, Bill, and I have all had an opportunity to go to Washington and see our system and work. And it's pretty interesting, actually. And our lobbyist is very good at getting us in contact with the right people to help push the right causes. We file amicus briefs. Those are friend of the court briefs if we need to on cases of significance to our committee. And then we also interact with the Department of Justice. Quick note on the DOJ. This is something that you folks should pay attention to. The DOJ Antitrust Division is looking at the consent decrees that were put in place regulating ASCAP and BMI. Those decrees were put in place quite a while ago, back in the 1940s, 1950s. And the DOJ is thinking about modifying them. They're even considering the possibility of eliminating them, which would be a really bad thing for the licensee community. Those decrees were put in place because they need to, both ASCAP and BMI were found guilty of antitrust violations. So we're keeping a close eye on that, and we're advocating for keeping the decrees in place. The co-chairs of our committee are Bill Blount and Russ Hout. I'm the executive director. Now switching over to the NRB NMLC, that's the non-commercial arm. That's the folks you're dealing with here today, myself and Harv and Bill. We have essentially the same mission and functions as the NRB MLC, but we're focused on non-com issues. Our broadcast licenses are set by statute. So our lobbying efforts there come into play if there's any modifications that take place to the statute. We do streaming license negotiations, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. And then we're doing the Web 5 proceeding. March 16th is not the hearing date anymore, so a little bit delayed. Let's take a look at the next slide. So non-commercial streaming. I'm going to spend a little bit of time digging into this. It's separate from your broadcast statutory license. So most of you, if you're at all involved in music licensing, you're going to say, hey, I already pay ASCAP and BMI, but you should be aware you're going to be paying them again, or you're going to be paying them for a different right very soon. The NRB and MLC represented stations, we've been licensed with ASCAP and BMI for many, many years. If you're not sure whether you're on our representation list, feel free to reach out to me. There's going to be some information on the last slide as far as contact info. You can reach out to myself or Harv or Bill or Elizabeth Meyer, who is one of our colleagues. She handles a lot of our administrative and back office and reporting work. If you're on our list, the way this has worked is we just had to send a letter to ASCAP and BMI. And we did this back in 2002. We sent a letter to them. And we said, we'd like to make sure we're licensed. And the license we're talking about is the ability to digitally stream the musical work. And so in this instance, we've had a license since 2002. Until last year, ASCAP and BMI were fine with giving us a license and not having us pay any rates. The ball was in their court statutorily. Last year, they showed up, they came to me and they said, hey, I think it's time that we talk about a rate. And you guys should probably start paying for this license you've had for 20 years. And I said, okay, fine. Let's have a discussion. So these are ongoing negotiations. They're going to be new mouths to feed, so to speak. That's the bad news. The good news is that if you think about your ASCAP and BMI bills now, you pay quite a bit to ASCAP and BMI. That's my guess. You're going to pay, based on the statutory license, depends on how much, where you're at, what market you are, et cetera, but you're going to pay a fair amount of money. This license is going to be less. This is more in line with what you're paying Sound Exchange because it's for digital rights. And the one thing to think about is many of you are just paying $500 to Sound Exchange. There's a group of PROs, which I showed earlier in this presentation, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR. What you should pay to them collectively, all four combined, should be about the same or even less than what you pay to Sound Exchange. That's our position. So what we're talking about here, if we can get this negotiation completed, is you're likely to be paying ASCAP and BMI $100 or $150 or $200 a year for the right to continue this license that's been in effect. CSAC, we've already had a license with, and we have that license in place. It renews periodically. It costs stations that are taking advantage of this license about $96 a year. And so that's how CSAC works. So GMR, also, we've negotiated with them, but they've taken a pause in our negotiations because they're involved in litigation with the Radio Music License Committee. And I know this is a lot to take in if this is not your area, but the RMLC is a separate music license committee. It's got radio in the name because it represents about 10 or 12,000 commercial radio stations, mostly music format, mostly secular. I work closely with them, and they're in litigation with GMR over what the right rate should be for their committee. So GMR does not want to finish a deal with us. Our committee, by the way, represents about 2,000 stations all in when you combine commercial and non-commercial. The good news again for GMR on this non-commercial streaming piece is the rates we were talking about were very nominal, less than $50, maybe less than $35 a year. The reason being is, and in fact, let's go to the next slide. We can talk a little more about GMR. GMR, I'm saying they're the new kid in town, and they do represent the Eagles, but they've been around for a little while. I was surprised as I was kind of refreshing thinking about this presentation. They've been formed in 2013. They've got a good business model. Their business model is actually to hire or retain kind of can't live without artists if you're in certain genres. So if you've got any radio stations that are programming classic rock or pop, somewhat in rap country, these guys have gone out and they've signed artists like Bruno Mars, Lady Gaga, Bruce Springsteen, Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles. In the countryside, I think they've got Carrie Underwood and some pretty big names. You can't have a country music station without playing Carrie Underwood or any of these other genres without playing those artists. So their business model is, we'll hire these can't live without artists. We don't want a giant stable of artists. We just want ones that you have to sign. They've sold to the artists the idea that they're premium artists. And so GMR is trying to use that to create royalty rates that are higher than you might pay on average to ASCAP or BMI. That's where their disagreement with the RMLC has come out, and that's why they're in litigation over rates. Our situation with them is a little bit unique. We're currently not licensed by them, but they've committed not to sue because we've had contract negotiations going on. They've also walked away from the table. So, the ball's kind of in their court. So we're protected, but we don't have a license. The other reason why we're unique is GMR has not signed any CCM artists. So we could rightfully, and we have, gone to them and said, hey, we don't play your music. By and large, we play virtually none of your music. If you can prove we play anything significant, we're happy to talk about, fair royalty rates. That doesn't get us out of the woods entirely, though, because no radio station controls their clock 24/7. They may take a sponsorship that's got music in the background. They may take syndicated programming on a weekend or overnight. We, as radio broadcasters, are responsible for having a license for any music that clears through our radio station because we're the last stop through to the listener. So the tenor of our negotiations with GMR has been more like, I need an insurance policy from you in case some random GMR music finds its way onto my radio station, because we really otherwise don't need a license from you. So stay tuned on this. Again, I'm happy to dig into this further with anyone. When these negotiations resume, I think we'll be in a position to offer a license to stations we represent that's pretty nominal and that would represent a pretty good insurance premium. Let's take a look at the next slide and talk a little bit about money. I would suspect that many folks watching this are going to say, what's the big deal? I mean, I pay $500 to Sound Exchange. That's not that much. It's annoying, but it's not life-changing. Well, here's why it's a big deal. Even if you're below the threshold and you're kind of a small webcaster, this Web 5 proceeding is big. Sound Exchange wants the minimum in this proceeding to increase by double to $100,000, that'd be crazy, to $1,000 per stream. They're also seeking a rate increase of 64% for streaming over the threshold. And when I say the 159, 140, that's this aggregate tuning hour threshold. You get a bucket of streaming in exchange for your $500. You get a bucket every month. And if you don't go over that bucket, you're fine. Think of it like a cell phone plan, a not unlimited data cell phone plan. You pay your fee, you get a certain amount of minutes, and then if you don't go over that, you're fine. If you go over it and you have that kind of a cell phone plan, you usually pay a lot for data overages. And that's the case with Sound Exchange too. That's where I mentioned here, they're seeking a rate increase of 64% for their over the threshold streaming rates. Another way to think of this is it's like a water bill or a heating oil bill. The more you consume, it's metered. For everything you consume above that threshold, you're paying for it. The way the rate works here is it's a tiny amount, 0.0018 cents per listener per stream. Sounds like not much money, right? But some of the larger broadcasters in our area, the larger non-com streaming broadcasters, are paying six figures a year because of that 0.0018 per listener per stream. And there are broadcasters that pay more than seven figures a year, well into seven figures a year for this. So that little number turns into a big bill. How much does it cost for us to participate in this Web 5 proceeding? Well, our committee, who's kind of the David to the Goliaths that are at the table, we're likely to spend $750,000 on this proceeding in outside legal fees and in experts. We have two professors, one from George Washington University in DC and another from Purdue, Indiana. Those experts are helping to advocate. Really, the sole part of our case is non-commercial broadcasters should be treated differently than commercial broadcasters. They should not pay the same exact rates as commercial broadcasters once that data plan is exceeded over the course of the month. And that's what's happening today. As soon as you're over your 159, 140 threshold, you pay, if you're a non-com broadcaster, the exact same amount that a commercial broadcaster would pay for every listener. And we think that's unfair. We think non-coms are non-coms for a reason. They don't have the ability to do what for-profit companies can do, like reinvest or pay that money to their stockholders. They have a mission. They have a focus. So our experts are advocating this. The other parties in this litigation, and this is no joke, I mean, they're spending $10 million or more each in this proceeding. These proceedings are kind of crazy in that they take 2 years to conduct. We started this proceeding last year in spring. It takes 2 years to set the rates for 5 years. So there's not much of a break on these things. It's kind of a treadmill that is really expensive. So let's take a look at the next slide. As the Beatles would say, help. We need pretty much everybody to help out here. Our committee, as I mentioned before, is not funded by the NRB. We don't get a line item from them. The dues paid to the NRB, none of it comes to us. We are 100% funded by donations. And so if you've heard of us and you're supporting us, thank you. We can't do anything really without the support of stations that we represent. If for some reason you haven't heard of us or you haven't supported us in the past, we ask that you please consider doing that now. I understand with COVID-19, the world is crazy, the future is uncertain, but even a small amount would really benefit us. We look at this a lot, particularly in the non-com space. The way the non-com Christian broadcasters are kind of distributed is there's a very small number of large non-com broadcasters that regularly exceed that threshold and that are clearly on our radar and we're on their radar. Those folks sit on our board of directors. We have a board of directors and many of them sit on our board. So they're well aware of these issues. But 90+% of non-com Christian broadcasters are the ones that are below that threshold. They're paying $500 a month. That's not a lot of money. I get it. But they're paying $500 a month and they're able to enjoy their area.
That's a year, not a month.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, a year. Thank you, Bill. I apologize. They're able to enjoy that bucket of discounted streaming. And so far, that's okay. But just keep in mind, as time goes by, more and more people are going to be streaming. One of the things we've seen from COVID-19 already in the studies that I've looked at is there are a lot of people that are now engaging in radio at home, and they're going to be doing that on their computer or on their smart speaker. Well, if you're listening on your smart speaker, you're paying these metered digital rates. That's different from the over-the-air rates. Your bucket, your data bucket, your plan is being filled a lot faster if people are listening to you at home on their smart speaker than if they're listening to you in the radio in their car. Nobody's driving their car in California, where I'm at. So nobody's listening to the radio. So that's where we really need to be looking towards the future. And so without belaboring this point, the takeaway I'd like you to consider is we're not asking by any means for equal gifts. That would be crazy. We don't want you, if you're a small broadcaster, to contribute what EMF is helping to contribute to something like this cause. But if everybody contributed a little bit, that would help us tremendously. And if we don't get sufficient donations, and believe me, this process of raising $750,000 for this proceeding has taken a lot of Bill and Harv and my time, as you might imagine. If we can't keep those donations coming, we're going to have to stop advocating for you guys in proceedings like this. And your fees will increase. I mean, there's a chance they may increase anyway, even if we do, participate in the proceeding. But whatever we can do to help, have your voices be heard as non-commercial Christian broadcasters, that's what we exist for. So any donations you can contribute would be welcome. And I think there's just one more slide. Well, actually, 2 more slides. We've kind of covered this already, so I'm just going to kind of click past it. That's just who we are and what we do. So one more. This is the contact information. And I don't know if, you're welcome to jot this down. I know they're recording this. If you reach out to us, I'm happy to send you a copy of this PowerPoint deck as well. But you can reach out to any of the 4 of us. Again, Elizabeth, who's not on video here and actively participating in this proceeding, is actually probably the person who can help you the most. If you have any kind of a question about your licensing structure, hey, so-and-so called me and they tell me I have to sign this thing. I don't know, should I? What should I do? You can reach out to any of us, but Elizabeth and I, and any of us would help out. Just to kind of give you some perspective as to where we're at, Elizabeth and I are both in Camarillo, California, about an hour north of LA. Harv's in Minneapolis, and Bill's down in Florida. And so with that, happy to answer any questions.
That's Atlanta area, not Florida.
Oh, that's right. You're in Atlanta. Boy, Bill, I'm just making all kinds of mistakes. I'm glad you're on the call to keep me straight. Thank you. Any questions?
So Scott, let me start, and thank you for the presentation. Let me start with a couple of questions. I mean, that's a hefty price tag for the litigation and everything like that. Is there any thought? Look, we know that they'll probably increase. That's probably in the cards, $750,000, and I'm guessing that doesn't include what other non-com broadcasters may do, whether it's EMF or Wave Media. I'm presuming that they have people at the table that are paying lawyers to help negotiate. When do we say, you know what, gosh, that's a lot of money just to litigate, and it may go through anyway? Why wouldn't there be, or is there any conversation about, let's just let them do what they do because it's going to cost us money anyway, and if we're trying to negotiate and it doesn't go through? You see where I'm going with this?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question, Chris, and we actually think about this quite a bit. It is a lot of money. Couple of things. One, the way this rate proceeding works, if you're not a party to the proceeding, you can't really engage with Sound Exchange or the other parties. So the way FMs and the EMFs of the world are participating through our committee because we are the party at the table. We can't really negotiate with them outside the scope of this proceeding. We're trying to negotiate a settlement with regard to the committee, but you have to be a party to the lawsuit in order to participate in those discussions. With regard to the cost, it is something that we're really mindful of. This is an expensive proceeding this time because we have experts in place. To be perfectly honest with you, when this comes around again in 4 or 5 years, I'm not sure it will make sense for our committee to participate. If the cost to play continues to go up, we may be better served saving that money and using it in other ways, using it to maybe introduce legislation that gets us part of what we're looking for, as opposed to participating in a proceeding. Why we think it's relevant and worth doing this time is the case that we're putting on is unique compared to prior cases. And the case is laser focused on trying to convince the copyright royalty judges simply that non-com should be treated different from commercials. We're not advocating, we are advocating for a rate structure. You have to put that out there, but really the win, if we can get it here, is getting a non-com broadcaster to be treated differently from a commercial broadcaster. We also are considering, even at this point in the proceeding, we're probably 75, 80% of the way through. The testimony, the actual trial, so to speak, lasts 6 weeks once it gets started. And then there's some motions and arguments that take place afterward. That'll be the finish line. We've done all what's called the discovery and the depositions and all of that. That's all done already. We're even at this late date considering whether if funding, isn't continuing, and we're thinking about, well, what would happen if we pulled out of the proceeding now? We're trying to negotiate a deal with Sound Exchange. They're very slow to respond to us as it stands right now. They're distracted along with others, by COVID and other things. So we're trying to figure out what's the best thing to do. If we decided to stop now, even one thing that we would be focused on and what we do with non-com broadcasters is to see if they can take more advantage of the existing licensing structure. So what I mean by that is every time you pay your $500, you get a bucket of discounted streaming. That's per channel, or per stream. So if you're a broadcaster and you have 8 radio stations and you're driving all of those radio stations to a single stream, all you can do is pay $500 and get one bucket. If you decided you wanted to have 8 different streams, one for each radio station, you'd have to pay your $500 8 times because they're each a separate channel, but you get 5 buckets to stream in. And those initial buckets are discounted. So that would be a way to take advantage of the existing structure and reduce your fees. So we're looking at all options, bottom line. And this may be the last proceeding.
And let me clarify that. Okay, so you got 8 radio stations and there's 8 buckets, but you can't take from station A that may not be doing all of its time and take its leftover and put it to station B that maybe. You can't do that, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. It's, some of the cell phone plans, to go back to my cell phone analogy, some of the cell phone plans allow you, if you're on a family plan, to kind of share that way. In this instance, it's no. It's like your bucket is yours for that station only. You can't, any unused bucket just is unused, which is why it's a benefit to channelize, what we call channelize. Some groups will call it localizing. And that is something I think you should consider anyway. But we're just kind of keeping an eye on things. And I think, with a little bit of luck, I think we'll be able to kind of finish this fight. But I'll tell you, at these prices, David beats Goliath. We're all people of faith here. But I don't think we're called to go into the arena over and over and over again as David and fight Goliath over and over and over again. So the next proceeding is one that we're going to really, really look very carefully at, participating or not participating. I will get on my soapbox for just a second and say, I don't think this should be our committee's job to do. I think that the National Association of Broadcasters should also represent non-commercial broadcasters. Non-coms are members of the NAB. They pay dues to the NAB. The NAB as a trade association is way more financially prepared than our committee is to participate in these proceedings. And we've begged the NAB to carry us on their coattails in this proceeding. And they've elected not to. And I won't get into all the details, but they've elected not to. We're going to continue to advocate with NAB to carry the freight because they're equipped to spend $10 or $15 million. There's no way our committee can.
I think about the context of what's going on, and this is just a reminder for, and obviously there are stations that are on top of this, but there really is a call for all radio stations, commercial and especially non-commercial, to really be aware of what's going on around us. It's very easy for us to think, well, I'm just here to minister to people. Well, that's true. You are ministering to people, but it requires a bit of business savvy, especially as the evolution of where we are as a country. It's not just about our religious freedom, but it's about the licensing aspect. It's about our freedom of speech. It really requires radio stations to become more astute as far as what these proceedings are and how can we best position ourselves as a group of non-commercial radio stations to not just take advantage of the full extent of the law, but of course utilize the resources that we have to make sure that we're at least getting equitable service.
Yeah, that's well said, Chris. I appreciate that.
Harv, Bill, anything to add to what Scott has passed along?
Well, I think one of the frustrating things for us is, through this period of time in this negotiation, is that Stock Exchange already has come to terms with NPR back last fall, and also another group, a small group called College Broadcasters, Inc. And they have their agreement, and then we submitted a proposal to them, and that proposal was turned down. We submitted it back in October, and in February, on Valentine's Day, we didn't get a love letter back from them. We got the fact that they didn't like our proposal. And so, we continue on trying to come to terms with them, and, we're walking down that road. But that's an important factor, I think, for us. And another reason that we're in this is to keep the rates down, because as Scott highlighted in the presentation, they not only want to increase your yearly 500 to 1,000, but the extra usage above the 159, 140 is 64% more that they want. And so, the question mark hanging over our heads is why should NPR get that much better rate than us? So that's one of the concerns that we're sitting with all the time.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and Harv, thank you for bringing that up. It is a challenge. Again, we want to pay fair rates. We're not looking to stiff artists and stiff songwriters. But what Harv alludes to here is something a little bit different. NPR has been able to settle with Sound Exchange early and easily in every one of these proceedings. Yet they won't talk to us in the same way. And we have made very, in my opinion, extremely generous offers to them to get their attention. And yet they still aren't interested in settling with us. Now, I don't know exactly why. They're not bad people. I had dinner with their general counsel, Colin Rushing, in Nashville back in February to kind of explore ways that we can kind of work on getting a resolution in place. To be perfectly blunt, it doesn't make sense for Sound Exchange to spend the money they're spending on this litigation to address the non-com issues and to have us spend $750,000 when, as a group, all of us together, we're spending less than $3 million a year to Sound Exchange. Well, why should our committee spend $750,000 and Sound Exchange spend probably $3 million to litigate with us on these non-com only issues? They should, I mean, the economics of it would lead to, you should sit down, let's come up with a reasonable solution. They're just not interested. I think it's because Sound Exchange clears $500 million in revenue a year on behalf of music licensees. That's with a B, $500 million a year. So when you talk about our license, our little slice of the pie representing less than 3 million a year, I think they don't much care about, that revenue relative to the 500 million. And I think that they know that they've got a position of strength because they can outspend us in the litigation 5-10 to 1. That's why they don't want to settle, I think.
Let me do this. Let me again thank, we're coming to a close on our time, but let me again thank you guys. I want to put up the contact information one more time so that people, if you missed it, these are the people that you would want to call. They also are the same people that can direct donations from your particular radio station. I don't want to, pressure or anything like that, but again, we are in this thing together to be able to make it affordable so that everybody can have the equity that comes with the music licensing. So that's what we've got. And gentlemen, I appreciate you very much for spending some time with us to help clarify some of the issues.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Chris. We always appreciate the opportunity, and our door is open. If you need to reach out to us, we're here to help. So whether you contribute or not, you can reach out to us, ask any questions that you have, and we're happy to see what we can do.
Excellent.
Hey, thanks guys for joining us today. We'll have a link to this webinar. So if you are interested in receiving a copy of this, shoot us an email, info@cmbonline.org. We look forward to providing that to everybody. We appreciate just the wealth of knowledge on a topic that's kind of a challenge to talk about. So we are grateful for each one of you and pray for lots of blessings. So everybody have a great Thursday from home or wherever you might be. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.